I've been thinking about preaching this sermon series for some time now. For a while, we've been doing a lot of reading, what I call the psychosocial, cultural areas of what's taking place in America, and therefore what is inevitably impacting all of us. And so I've been thinking about this sermon series quite a while. 4 keys to joy. There are more than 4 keys to joy, and you may hear some more after this sermon series, but this is 4 pieces that we'll be talking about today. Today is the part about building a spiritual foundation. Epiphany Sunday, we're going to read, and it works fine with this sermon. I'm going to read from the screen, Matthew, the 2nd chapter. It's easier. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who's been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for this child, and when you have found him, bring me word so that I may also go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. And then opening their treasure chest, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In the year 2017, approximately 72,000 Americans lost their lives to drug overdoses. Approximately 50,000 of those were killed by opioids. It's just one of the many disturbing statistics about what is taking place in America today, the kind of gloom and doom that has spread across our land. Since this is the first Sunday of the new year, and I'm basically an optimistic person, I don't want to depress you too much with more statistics, but let me just say briefly that we're also seeing an enormous rise in suicides, primarily amongst middle-aged men, but also amongst women. And for 2 years in a row now, we have had a declining life expectancy in America, primarily due to what are called these deaths of despair. And this is stunning. We are the only developed nation in the world where this is taking place. We've been watching this. You've been seeing it off and on. I've been reading about it. I want to show you part of the research that I've done was an essay written by a brilliant journalist by the name of Andrew Sullivan, a practicing Catholic, called "The Poison We Pick. This Nation Pioneered Modern Life. Now epic numbers of Americans are killing themselves with opioids to escape it." The question is, why are so many Americans unhappy? This is not a sermon about opioid addiction, but I would say to you that in this particular essay, he takes us through the 6,000-year love affair between the human being and the poppy, the opium. I had no idea. 6,000 years we've been cultivating and using the opium to make us feel better. During all the years of the American experiment, opium has been with us. But in the last decade, opium use and the lethal nature of opium in its many forms, especially opioids and heroin, has skyrocketed. So again, I say this is not about opioid use. There were two paragraphs in this essay that jumped out at me because I've been thinking about what I call the spiritual emptiness, the spiritual vacuum of modern day America. The first came pretty early in the essay. I'm going to read it to you. Meaning, we're talking about meaning of life, purposefulness. Meaning, once effortlessly provided by a more unified and often religious culture shared at least nominally by others, is harder to find. And the proportion of Americans who identify as nones with no religious affiliation has risen to record levels. And I bolded this. This is what just jumped out at me. Even as we near peak employment and record high median household income, a sense of permanent economic insecurity, and there's that term, and spiritual emptiness has been widespread across our land. And then at the conclusion of this rather long essay, there was a paragraph in which he talks about the opioid epidemic as really simply being emblematic of deeper spiritual issues within our country. To see this epidemic as simply a pharmaceutical or chemically addictive problem is to miss something. The despair that currently makes so many want to fly away. Opioids are just one of the many ways Americans are trying to cope with an inhuman new world where everything is flat, where communication is virtual. We're going to talk about that some next week. And where those core elements of human happiness, faith, family, and community, we're going to be talking about those three a lot, seem to elude so many until we resolve these deeper social, cultural, and psychological problems, until we discover a new meaning or reimagine our old religion. You figure out where I'm going here. Or reinvent our way of life. The poppy will flourish. So we'll ask that question again. What is it that is going on in America that so many Americans are so unhappy? Now, I want to make a distinction. I'm going to use the word happiness and joy somewhat interchangeably here, but there is a distinction between those two words. Happiness is something that we experience. It's a good thing, but it is fleeting. Joy is a Christian virtue. Joy is something that undergirds our lives. In times when we're feeling great, when we're feeling happy, those are joyful times. But joy is also what sustains us in difficult times, in times when we are sad, when we are grieving, when we are struggling. So joy is the important spiritual Christian virtue that we're talking about here. And so I'm just going to say I am deeply prejudiced in terms of my answers here. A lot of what we're going to preach about over the next 4 Sundays, these are shared values with sociologists, psychologists, people who are studying the culture. A lot of this we are shared, but my deep prejudice is going to be present right here in this very first sermon. Put that slide up. Key number 1 to experiencing joy on a continuing basis is a deep spiritual foundation. A strong spiritual foundation is undeniably the key, in my opinion, to living a joyful life which has meaning and purpose. Last week I had coffee with a friend of mine, a leader in this particular church, and we were at Starbucks and we were talking, and I honestly don't know how the conversation got there, but he brought it up, not I. He said, you know, to simply say, I believe in God means nothing. He said, anybody can say, I believe in God. It doesn't really mean anything at all. And I have to say to you that I really never had thought about that. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, that's one of the most important things I've ever heard in my life. I got to thinking about these Pew surveys that, at least those of us in the religious business, we watch these pretty carefully. Pew is a research firm that probably does the best job of surveying on a number of social and cultural issues, but certainly religious issues, where people are in terms of their religious life in America. And so for years, we've been reading these surveys, and to some extent, they have been very, very disturbing. Fewer people saying that they practice their faith in a denomination of some kind. This is what Andrew Sullivan referred to as the nuns. What is your religion? I'm a nun. I don't really practice my faith. And more people claiming to be agnostics, they're not sure about God, or atheists. They do not believe in God. Those numbers and that research has been disturbing. But I've always been somewhat reassured by this question in the survey. Actually, two questions. Do you believe in God? And guess what? The vast majority of Americans still click yes on that. Yes, I believe in God. The vast majority of Americans. This question, do you pray on a regular basis? Guess what? Check that box. Most Americans pray on a regular basis. And I've always been reassured by those numbers until Michael Kerner said, you know what? Just to say you believe in God doesn't mean anything. And when I started thinking about this issue of prayer, just to say I pray on a regular basis doesn't mean anything either, if you mean by that praying the way I used to pray when I was in college. You're already giggling about this. I mean, you already get it, right? When I was in college, I believed in prayer. After a night of just goofing off or sometimes out carousing, I would go to take my big test the next morning. And I mean, every time without fail, because I was raised in a religious home, without fail, I would pray, dear God, please help me do my best on this test. I mean, you already know by now, don't you, that that isn't really practicing prayer. It took me years to discover that. And for somebody to simply say, yeah, I believe in God, that doesn't mean they really believe in God, doesn't it? What if we were to rewrite those questions in the Pew Survey so that it reads something like this? Do you practice your faith every single day? Do you believe in God in such a way that it has reordered the priorities of your life? Do you pray every single day in such a way that it changes the way in which you live your life during that day? What if we were to ask ourselves, has your faith, has your belief in God, has your practice, you know, I've started using this word practice a lot. You can say I'm a soccer player, but if you don't practice, you're not really a soccer player. And you can just apply that to whatever you want to apply. I used to be a pilot. Technically, I'm still an instrument-rated pilot. You would not want to go up in an airplane with me as your pilot because I haven't done it in a long time. So the question for you and me today is, if we say that the key to joy, the number one key to joy, is a strong spiritual foundation, what does it mean to say that we have a faith that we practice every single day? When we turn to this story about the kings, it's a wonderful story. And I have to tell you, most of the time when we read about the kings, it's during Christmas. And a lot of times it will be maybe a Christmas pageant that we attend. And the kings will come down, we'll watch the kings as they bring their gifts and put them in front of the manger of the baby. And that's a great part of the story, what we call the adoration of the kings. But as I read this story this year, it seems to me that far and away the most important part of this story is the first part of the story. The journey of the kings, or maybe we should say even the intentional decision of the kings to make the journey. We don't know a whole lot about the kings. Scholars almost all agree on a couple of things. They came from the east far off. They were inevitably Gentiles, not Jews. So part of what the meaning of Epiphany is the revealing of Jesus to the Gentile nation as well as to the Jewish nation. Almost all scholars believe that they were probably astrologers. By that, they were people who studied the stars. So they wouldn't be astronomers by today's standards of astronomy, but they would still be scientists in the eyes of people in that day. They studied the stars. They had some kind of magical things and mystical things, perhaps, but most people considered them to be learned people who studied the stars. So they're Gentiles, they're scientists, and given the context of the story, I would say that there are two or three other things as well. They are part philosopher, part theologian. They're looking for truth. They are seekers. They are pilgrims searching for God. And I think what makes this story about the pilgrims, the first part of it, the journey, what makes it so important is the way in which it informs us about the true nature of the spiritual journey. It took me a long time to figure this out. I kept reading it and reading it and thinking about it. And I thought, what is it that we learn from these who were called wise ones about the nature of the spiritual journey? And the first piece of it was, of course, the intentionality. They decided to make the journey. And once they started, they were not turning back. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, they chose a direction rather than a destination. They chose a star rather than a location. You see, which means that they chose to follow God rather than their own instincts. You start thinking about this. I think it's really fascinating. A destination is something that we're all familiar with. A location. We like to travel, don't we? In the summertime, I love to go to the mountains where it's cool. I can get in my truck, put it on GPS. I know where I'm going. I know how to get there. I'm in control. I have friends who just got back from, I don't know, some beach in some really warm place. I'm not sure where they were, but I thought, when I retire, I think I'm going to do that this time of the year. Go someplace where it's cold, where it's really warm and sunny. I love the ocean as well. You see, we choose these locations that we're in charge of and we can control, and we think they will make us happy. And guess what? Sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. We choose other locations that we think will make us happy. We say, I want that college degree or that postgraduate degree, or I want that job, or we want that house, or I need to close that big sale. And we think that once we get to that location or to that destination that we have chosen, it will make us happy. And sometimes it does. But it is never happiness that lasts. It is never happiness that sustains us, especially not in the tough times. A location, a destination is something that we choose. A direction, a star is something that God chooses. And the difference between a normal journey and a spiritual journey is the commitment to follow the star, to let God choose the direction, to be guided by God. If you've been listening to me preach over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, I don't know when I first came up with this, you have probably heard me say this on a number of occasions. If you've heard all of my sermons, maybe a dozen times, but you may not have never heard this before at all. It doesn't make any difference because you're going to hear it more between now and the time I walk away from here. And that is this. There's really only one real question that makes any difference to you and me in terms of our spiritual foundation. There are a lot of questions and a lot of issues that we can disagree about. There are a lot of cultural issues. There are a lot of issues that have to do with the way in which we live out our lives, where there might be more than one answer, or maybe the answer is gray. It's not a binary answer. Almost all of the big issues we face in life are things that we can disagree about. That's what makes us Wesleyans, United Methodists. But there is one issue in life, and it's what I call a binary question. This is it. Either God is or God isn't. Either God is or God isn't. Guess what? You don't get a third choice on that question. And so what I think a lot of people do, people both within the church and outside the church, what a lot of people do is they just run from that question. Run as fast as they can from that question because they know that if they answer that question, it's going to change their lives. You can answer the question, I don't believe there is a God. And you can still have moments of happiness. You can still live lives where you serve. There can be meaning and purpose in your life. But it's entirely different when you answer the question when you say God is. Because once you say God is, it changes everything about your life. Not only does it give you a sense of meaning and purpose and joy that undergirds every moment of your life because you know there is meaning and purpose that comes from someplace outside of you. But once you say God is, it changes the way you think about life. It changes the way you think about your life. It changes the way in which you think about the end of your life. It changes the way in which you think about your spouse and your children and your grandchildren. It changes the way in which you think about your job. It changes the way in which you think about those you work with, about your neighbors. It changes the way in which you think about your community. It changes the way in which you start your day, and it changes the way in which you practice your faith. This much I know. The first key to living a life that is truly joyful, undergirded by God's grace and love, is the building of a strong spiritual foundation which begins with God is.